Now we are going to learn about a systematics topic called concept of species. The foremost task of a taxonomist is to know the different kinds of animals occurring in nature. These kinds are actually the species. History tells us that the existence of species has been recognized by man since the dawn of civilization. To define a species has been one of the major problems of a taxonomist. The main purpose of defining species is to make it a historical, temporal, and spatial entity. Various definitions have been put forward by various workers, and yet the uncertainty persists. Even a major symposium held in 1957 on the species problem failed to arrive at a definite conclusion. This confusion is also related to the fact that some workers believed them as man's creations, while others believed them to be products of evolution. Cuvier in 1829 defined it as the assemblage descended from one another or from common parents and of those who resemble each other. Darwin in 1859 also could not clearly define the species, and so he was not able to solve the problem of speciation. Since then, there has been a tendency among the biologists to doubt the fundamental importance of the species and to deny its central position. Then Thompson in 1937 defined species as the group of individuals distinguished by an irreducible set of constant properties and connected by descent and genetic relationship. Later, there is a single systematic category which, in contrast to others, withstood all the changes in nomenclature with an amazing tenacity, and that is the category of species. Again, in the same year, 1937, he defined it as that stage of evolutionary process at which the once actually or potentially interbreeding array of forms become segregated into two or more separate arrays which are physiologically capable of interbreeding. In 1971, he again defined species as a groups of populations and the gene exchange between which is limited or prevented in nature by one or by a combination of several reproductive isolating mechanisms. According to Huxley, in 1942, the species can be regarded as a geographical definable group whose members actually interbreed or are potentially capable of interbreeding in nature, which normally in nature does not interbreed freely or with full fertility with related groups and is distinguished from them by constant morphological differences. Then Zimmerman in 1948 presented a very confusing definition when he defined a species as groups of organisms which are so similar that on superficial observation they are considered to be of the same kind. Then Borgmeier in 1963 gave a good definition when he explained species as natural phenomena and biological unit based on objective facts. Then Wilmot in 1967 explained species as a well-defined, autonomous and persistent organic unit living in a free state of nature, not grading freely into any other unit, and generally of less perfect fecundity outside than inside its limits. It moreover differs from all other species not only morphologically but also in its physiological manifestations and its psychic behavior. In another statement, it is explained as a group of individuals of common descent with certain constant specific characters in common, which are represented in the nucleus of each cell by constant characteristic sets of chromosomes carrying homozygous genes, causing as a rule of intrafertility and intersterility. Modern workers speak of a biological species and considered it an intervention of the new systematics. They have made it clear that the species is a unit as important and meaningful in biology as the cell or as is the atom in physics. In fact, the species now occupies a central position in the hierarchy of organisms. It is not regarded as a particular kind of organism but a kind of population. Mayer in 1957 reviewed the works of others on species problem and came to the conclusion that all these definitions given so far by earlier workers earlier workers can be broadly grouped into three main concepts: typological or essentialist species concept, nominalistic species concept, and the biological species concept. Besides the evolutionary species concept of Grant in 1971 and recognition species concept of Patterson in 1985 and Lambert et al. In 1987 have also been added here. Then typological species concept. According to this concept, the observed diversity of the universe reflects the existence of a limited number of underlying universals or types. Individuals do not stand in any special relation to each other, being merely expressions of the same type. If two individuals or groups of individuals appear sufficiently different, they are different species. Variations is considered a trivial and irrelevant phenomenon. This concept, going back to the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle, was the species concept of Linnaeus and his followers. This school of philosophy is now usually referred to as essentialism, following Karl Popper, and the above mentioned species concept as the essentialist species concept. According to it, the species can be recognized by their essential nature or essential characteristics and thus are expressed in their morphology or species in a group of organisms whose physical characteristics, color, size, habitat, etc., segregate them from all other organisms. It is therefore also called the morphological species concept. Then criticisms. Even though the morphological evidence is still used for inference on the delimitations of biological species, a morphological species concept is no longer accepted by the modern biologist. However, in addition to various conceptual reasons for its rejection, two most important ones are: one, individuals are frequently found in nature that are clearly conspecific with other individuals in spite of striking morphological differences due to sexual dimorphism, age difference, polymorphism, and other forms of individual variation. It is also of no use in the case of caterpillar and butterfly or whatever other drastic forms of intraspecific variation are found in nature. Two, it is equally helpless in the case of the so-called sibling species, that is perfectly good genetic species but lacking conspicuous morphological differences. The next concept, nominalistic species concept. Nominalistic species concept. This concept is of Occam and his followers, who believed that only individuals exist, while species are man's own creations. This concept was popular in France in the 18th century, but surprisingly, it is still used, though very rarely, by some, especially botanists. Nature produces individuals and nothing more. Species have no actual existence in nature. They are mental concepts and nothing more, and this have been invented in order that we may refer to great numbers of individuals collectively. Then some criticisms also arise with this concept. No biologist can agree with the idea that the species are man made when it is now an established fact that they are the products of evolution. The basic drawback with the nominalists was their misinterpretation of causal relation between similarity and relationship. Members of a species taxon are similar to each other because of common heritage. It is not sure that they belong to this taxon because they are similar, as claimed by these workers. The situation is the same as with the identical twins. Two brothers are identical twins not because they are extraordinarily similar, but because they are both derived from a single zygote. This, anyone who understands evolution will outright reject this concept. Then biological species concept. When it was realized in the 18th century that none of the above mentioned concepts was applicable to biological species, an entirely new species concept emerged around 1750. But it took a number of years in finding its place in biology. The biological species concept was introduced by Mayer. This concept is completely different from the earlier ones. According to this concept, species are groups of interbreeding natural populations that are reproductively isolated from other such groups. Thus, the species has three separate functions. It forms a reproductive community. The individuals of an animal species recognize each other as potential mates and seek each other for the purpose of reproduction. The species specific genetic program of each individual ensures intraspecific reproduction. It is an ecological unit regardless of the individuals. composing it interacts as a unit with other species with which it shares the environment. It is also a genetical unit consisting of a large interconnecting gene pool, whereas the individual is merely a temporary vessel holding a small portion of the contents of the gene pool for a short period. The ability of one or more populations to interbreed or to hybridize denotes that its combined members belong to a single species, whereas a failure of hybridization denotes populations belong to different species. The individual members of a population possess some cytological, genetical, or ecological isolating mechanism which maintains the gene pool of the species. Each species is thus limited by its genetic endowment due to their reproductive habits and potentials. The contemporary sexual species are natural self-defining classes. Although this concept was wide following, it possesses problems when applied to certain groups. The species are mainly determined in their visible characteristics, and in some cases, such characteristics are either imperceptible and or poorly developed. Under such circumstances, one has to depend on invisible or less convenient characters because the species do exist irrespective of being visibly expressed or not. The major hurdles are created in the following cases when this concept is applied. Apomictic or asexual groups. The asexual reproducing forms do not fulfill the criteria of interbreeding, which is foremost characteristic of biological species concept. Then parthenogenesis is regarded as a degeneration process of sexual mode of reproduction. Some characters of a sexually reproducing species are always present in the apomictic group. Apomictic group. Such cases pose great problems to a taxonomist unless he is thoroughly versed with the whole complex. Apomictic injury is also the sexual ones before attempting to classify them. Mayer in 1940 gave a good reasoning about such groups in being descendants of a single sexual species as a collective species, including all strains arising due to mutations except polyploids, and these are likely to terminate sooner or later, either by extinction or fusion with another line through a sexual process. Mayer in 1940 gave a good reasoning about such groups in being descendants of a single sexual species as a collective species, including all strains arising due to mutations except polyploids. And these are likely to terminate sooner or later, either by extinction or fusion with another line through a sexual process. Then sibling and cryptic species. Such species pose the greatest problems to a taxonomist unless he is well versed with his group, as these are feebly or not at all separated morphologically. Then gradual speciation. It is very important for taxonomists to have a thorough knowledge of all stages of differentiation between the individual variant and the well characterized distinct species, as many species do pass through intermediate stages like biotypes, races, subspecies, ecotypes, or semi-species. Moreover, we still do not have any sure method of designating an entity as a subspecies or species. Therefore, this criterion at the moment solely depends on the knowledge of an experienced taxonomist. Then rings of races. These two pose problems, especially when extreme races are intersterile. These are thus theoretically good species like two allopatric ones, not related by integrating populations. If intermediate populations are taken into account, each such population, irrespective of differences, sometimes interbreeds with a number of populations on each side of their own population. Under such cases, it becomes difficult for a biologist to regard such end populations as different species or of the same species on the basis of reproductive isolation. The problem also arises in one takes into account the reproductive criterion following the theory of evolution, explaining the fact that all organisms have descended from relatively few initial individuals. In majority of such cases, the parent and offspring generations can potentially interbreed, producing temporal chain of races except asexually reproducing forms. If the principle of interbreeding is applied in these cases, one will be forced to believe all or nearly all individuals or animals, both of the past and the present, belong to the same species. Thus, theoretically, if one insists on depending on the criterion of interbreeding and reproductive isolation of a biological species concept, he will be forced to arrive at some decision which may be arbitrarily with regard to reproductive criteria. Then hybrid complexes, the biological species concept also fails to give satisfactory answer when applied to hybrid complex. Lotzi in 1925 called such forms as synagmion. Mayer in 1940 redefined it as the one which reflects the sum total of species or species, semi-species linked by frequent or occasional hybridization, insisting that hybrids produced by the members of a syngamion can be either fertile or sterile. In a syngamion, the original biological species may either persist as a discrete entity or comes to occupy a definitely subordinate position to the total complex when it is found in varying degree of dissolution. Sibley in 1954 called the species-like entities as semi-species, which are discernible on the basis of partial reproductive isolation externally, contrasting with free gene exchange internally. In spite of these shortcomings, the biological species concept has become the working definition of species among most population and evolutionary biologists. Then evolutionary species concept. Grant in 1971 supports the biological species concept but only for sexually reproducing forms. It fails when applied to uniparental organisms where absolute self-fertilization renders inbreeding impossible, thereby suppressing the physical link which is a must for the individual of the same species. The same viewpoint is also expressed by McLeish and Simpson in 1961. Simpson then defines an evolutionary species as a lineage, an ancestral descendant sequence of populations evolving separately from others and with his own unitary evolutionary role and tendencies. The evolutionary species concept of Grant is based on this fact and is capable to not only apomictic populations but also fossil lineages. Wheatley in 1978 reconsidered the evolutionary concept and concluded that a species is a single lineage of ancestral descended population of organisms which maintains its own evolutionary tendencies and historical fate. Then Willis in 1981, on the contrary, believes that each species is an internally similar part of a phylogenetic tree. A species may be branched or not. It originated and perhaps ended at some intermediate in characters, plane or cross section across a branch in the case of allopatric speciation, or at a plane across the base of a branch in the case of sympatric speciation. Then recognition species concept. This concept has been put forward by Peterson in 1985 and Lambert et al. In 1987 as a replacement to biological species concept. They have even advocated its superiority over the later. According to this concept, Peterson in 1987, a species is that most inclusive population of individual biparental organisms which share a common fertilization system. The fertilization system includes all aspects of an organism's biology that contribute to the ultimate function of bringing about fertilization while organism occupies its normal habitat. The organisms recognize each other as mates. This recognition may be active as in courtship rituals and responses or passive as in mechanisms of gamete fusion. This concept does not include all barriers to gene flow that act after fertilization, including zygotic or hybrid inviability and hybrid sterility. This concept has not received support. Then Bitlin in 1987 stated that Peterson and his colleagues misinterpreted Dobzhansky and Mayer's original ideas. Cohen et al. In 1988 did not support this concept and found it all having more problems than anticipated. They had compared its disadvantages over biological species concept in detail. So conclusion. These species concepts considerably overlap each other. For some organisms, one definition is more suitable than other, and for some, the definitions will coincide. It becomes even more difficult to estimate the populations of species in a living world or in species groups of organisms to which any two, three, or all species definitions apply. In any case, the biological distinctness is primary and the morphological difference secondary. The morphological distinctness is not an essential attribute of a species as its status can be acquired with or without the simultaneous or delayed acquisition of differential morphological characters. The evolutionary species concept recognized or uniparental organisms is also not very promising. It does not possibly give positive clue to the rest of either interfertility or conspecific populations or intersterility or heterospecific individuals. Moreover, our knowledge of the number of uniparental organisms is too incomplete to permit an estimation of the proportion of evolutionary species that are not also biological species. There may even be some biological species whose evolutionary role appears identical to the observer, but the number of such very close sibling species is impossible to estimate, and by their very nature, such cases would be extremely difficult to detect. In the recent years, the development of cladistic analysis has given the species problem a particular new vitality. In addition to the new species concepts rooted in the ideas of cladistics, other new concepts based on behavioral as well as ecological criteria were proposed. Misha and Donogh even suggested that no one species concept is applicable across all taxa and that to search for one is futile and systematics should adopt a pluralistic approach. Then Kuros and Donogh analyzed the interrelations of various species concepts without advocating any one of them over the others. Thus, it is still not cannot be decided until a way is found to correlate the species composed of population is supposedly phenotypically related. If we accept one, we cannot deny the other. Presently, the zoologist can deal with them separately, but yet cannot arrive at a final single concept by combining them. The confusion still persists, and if it is not settled earlier, it would not be surprising when zoological taxonomy may again be forced to surrender and abandon a well established term, the species, as has already happened in the well established term, the genotype. Emerson in 1941 had attempted to combine the biological species concept and evolutionary species concept and define a true species as that which has evolved or evolving, reproductively isolated and genetically distinct groups of natural populations. Then supporting the concept of interbreeding as primary interest of phylogenetic systematics of Donogh in 1988, and then considering it the basis of species concepts, Christopherson in 19 I'm sorry for mispronouncing Christopherson in 1995, I'm not sure about the pronunciation, defined his theoretical or ontological species concept as a single lineage of ancestral descent and sexual populations genetically integrated by historically contingent events of interbreeding. The concept is closest to evolutionary species concept of Delay in 1978. In addition to this, Christopherson also provided operational or epistemological concept of species based on that of Kraft in 1983 and 1987, Wheeler and Nixon in 1990, and Davis and Nixon in 1992 as an introducible cluster of sexual organisms within which there is a parental pattern of ancestry and descent, and that is diagnosably distinct from other such clusters by a unique combination of fixed characters. This, according to the scientist, theoretical species concept is transformational or dynamic, where species are viewed as stages in the evolutionary process and ranged sequentially at the nodes of phylogenetic tree, while epistemological concept is taxic, like static, where species are viewed as the smallest discrete entities that can be recognized as an outcome of the evolutionary process. The modern fields of biology are also giving us much more valuable information, and would not be too late to pursue when such fields, particularly biochemistry, would reveal many interesting and hidden characteristics of a species. Then Florkin in 1964 gave a biochemical definition of a species as groups of individuals with more or less similar combinations of sequences of purine and pyrimidine bases in their macromolecules of DNA, and with a system of operations and operators and repressors leading to the biosynthesis of similar amino acid sequences. Now we are going to have a very quick recap of all the species concepts we have learned so far. So we will be learning about that. So a species is a fundamental unit of biological classification and refers to a group of organisms that are capable of interbreeding and producing fertile offspring in nature. The concept of a species is based on the idea of reproductive isolation, which means that members of the same species can mate and produce viable offspring, but cannot mate successfully with members of other species. Species are the basic building blocks of biodiversity, and their identification and classification are essential for understanding the patterns and processes of evolution and the distribution of life on Earth. Taxonomists use a variety of criteria to identify and classify species, including morphological characteristics and genetic and molecular data, and ecological and behavioral traits, and geographical distribution. Then the scientific naming of species follows a standardized system known as binomial nomenclature, which was developed by the Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus in the 18th century. Each species is assigned a unique two-part Latinized name consisting of a genus name and a specific epithet. For example, Homo sapiens is the scientific name for modern humans, with Homo representing the genus and sapiens being specific epithet. Then species play a crucial role in ecosystems functioning and provide important ecosystem services such as pollination, seed dispersal, and nutrient cycling. They also have significant economic, cultural, and aesthetic value, and their conservation is essential for maintaining the health and integrity of plan, planet's ecosystem and the well-being of human societies. Then species description. Species can be described and characterized by a variety of traits, including their morphology, physiology, behavior, genetics, and ecology. Morphological traits will be there. Like morphological traits are physical characteristics that can be observed and measured, such as body size, shape, color, and structure. These traits are often used to identify and distinguish between different species. For example, the black bear is distinguished from other bear species by its short, curved claws, long snout, and shaggy black fur. Then behavioral traits. Behavioral traits refer to the actions and activities of organisms such as their feeding habits, mating behaviors, and social interactions. These traits can be used to identify and classify species and can also provide insights into their ecological and evolutionary relationships. For example, the courtship displays and songs of birds can be used to distinguish between different species within the same genus. Then genetic traits. Genetic traits refers to the DNA sequences and genetic variations that distinguish between different individuals and populations. Genetic data can be used to identify and classify species and can also provide insights into their evolutionary history and relationships. For example, genetic analysis have shown that humans share common ancestor with chimpanzees and bonobos, and are therefore classified in the same family hominid. Then ecological traits. Ecological traits refer to the ways in which species interact with their environment, including their habitat, preferences, diet, and ecological rules. These traits can be used to identify and classify species and can also provide insights into their ecological relationships and functions. For example, the giant panda is classified as a specialized herbivore that feeds almost exclusively on bamboo and is considered a keystone species in its forest ecosystem, and it's also a flagpole species. So, you know, it acts as a attention seeker, not in a literal sense, it attracts more attention to that particular part, which also helps for the conservation of other organisms along with that particular part. Overall, species are characterized by a combination of this and other traits, and their classification and identification can involve multiple lines of evidence and methods. What makes a species unique? A species is a unique group of organisms that share certain characteristics and can interbreed to produce viable offspring. There are several factors that make a species unique, like reproductive isolation is the major point. Members of the same species can interbreed and produce fertile offspring, but are reproductively isolated from other species. This means that the genetic material of a species is not shared with other species, leading to distinct evolutionary lineages. Then, genetic distinctiveness. Species have unique genetic characteristics that set them apart from other species. Genetic differences can arise due to mutations, genetic drift, and natural selection. Morphological characteristics. Species have unique physical features such as body size, shape, color, and structure that distinguish them from other species. These characteristics can be used to identify and classify species. Then, ecological niche. Species occupy a unique ecological niche or role in their environment. This includes their habitat preferences, diet, and ecological interactions with other species. Then, behavioral characteristics. Species have unique behaviors such as mating rituals, vocalizations, and social interactions that distinguish them from other species. Overall, that makes a species unique is a combination of factors that reflect their evolutionary history, then genetic makeup, morphology, ecology, and behavior. Each species has its own unique set of characteristics that distinguish it from other species, and these characteristics can be used to classify and identify species. Like geographical distribution is also another important point. Species have unique geographical distributions or ranges that reflect their historical and contemporary dispersal patterns and ecological preferences. For example, the polar bear is uniquely adapted to live in Arctic region and is not found in other parts of the world. Then molecular characteristics. In addition to morphological and genetic traits, species can be distinguished based on molecular characteristics such as protein sequences and gene expression profiles. These traits can be used to infer evolutionary relationships and identify species that are difficult to distinguish based on traditional morphological traits. Then hybridization is also another important point. Although species are typically defined as reproductively isolated, there are cases where species can interbreed and produce hybrid offspring. Hybridization can sometimes occur between closely related species, leading to the formation of new hybrid species with unique genetic and morphological characteristics. Then, evolutionary history. Each species has its own unique evolutionary history, reflecting its ancestral lineages, past environmental conditions, and historical events such as mass extinctions and speciation events. Understanding a species' evolutionary history can provide insights into its genetic and morphological characteristics as well as its ecological and behavioral traits. Then, cultural significance. Finally, species can be culturally significant to human societies, serving as sources of food, medicine, cultural symbols, and aesthetic inspiration. The unique characteristics and ecological roles of species have inspired art, literature, and scientific inquiry for centuries, highlighting the importance of understanding and preserving species diversity. Then, monotypic species types. A monotypic species is a taxonomic group that contains only one recognized species. So, a monotypic species is a taxonomic group that contains only one recognized species. This means that the genus or family to which species belongs consists of a single species. Monotypic, monotypic species are relatively rare, but they occur in a variety of taxonomic groups, including plants, animals, fungi, and bacteria. There are various types of monotypic species. Like monotypic species can be classified into two species, like nominal and autonymic. What is nominal monotypic species? This type of monotypic species has only one species, but its genus contains other species that have been classified under a different genus name. For example, the okapi or Okapia johnstoni is the only recognized species in the genus Okapia, but it was previously classified in the genus Giraffa. And autonymic monotypic species. This type of monotypic species has only one recognized species and its genus name is the same as its species name. For example, the red panda is the only recognized species in the genus Ailuris. Then description and procedure. The procedure for identifying a monotypic species is the same as for any other species. Taxonomists use morphological, molecular, ecological, and behavioral characteristics to distinguish new species or one species from another. If only one species is recognized in a particular genus or family, it is considered to be a monotypic species. 4. Aardvark is a mammal, is the only recognized species in the family. Orycteropodidae. Then platypus. Ornithorhynchus anathinus is unique mammal, and that is the only recognized species in the genus Ornithorhynchus and family Ornithorhynchidae. Then ginkgo tree, Ginkgo biloba. This ancient tree is the only recognized species in the genus Jingoaceae. Monotypic species are important for several reasons. First, they are often unique and have distinctive characteristics that make them interesting and important subjects for scientific study. Second, they can provide insights into the evolutionary history of a particular taxonomic group as well as the biogeography and ecology of a particular region. Finally, they are important for conservation efforts as they often have small population sizes and restricted geographic ranges, making them vulnerable to habitat loss, climate change, and other threats. So, in conclusion, monotypic species are taxonomic groups that contain only one recognized species. They can be either nominal, or autonymic, and occur in a variety of taxonomic groups. Monotypic species are important for scientific study, conservation efforts, and understanding the evolutionary history of a particular taxonomic group. Then, polytypic species. Polytypic species, also known as polymorphic species, are taxonomic groups that contain multiple subgroups or subspecies. The subgroups are geographically distinct populations that share some but not all characteristics with each other. And polytypic species can be classified into three types like clinal, geographic, and ecological. Clinal polytypic species. This type of polytypic species shows gradual and continuous variation in characteristics across its geographic range. This means that the traits of the species gradually change from one end of the species to the other without sharp boundaries between subgroups. Then geographic polytypic species is there. This type of polytypic species is characterized by the presence of distinct subgroups that are geographically separated from each other. The subgroups can be differentiated based on morphological, molecular, or behavioral characteristics. Then ecological polytypic species. This type of polytypic species is characterized by the presence of distinct subgroups that are adapted to different ecological niches. The subgroups can be differentiated based on their habitat preferences, feeding behaviors, or other ecological characteristics. Then description and examples. The procedure for identifying a polytypic species is more complex than for a monotypic species. Taxonomists use a combination of morphological, molecular, ecological, and behavioral characteristics to distinguish subgroups within a polytypic species. For example, grey wolf, Canis lupus. This species is polytypic and has several subspecies, including the Arctic wolf, the Mexican wolf, the Eurasian wolf. The subspecies differ in their physical characteristics, geographic range, and genetic makeup. Then, eastern diamondback rattlesnake. This venomous snake is polytypic and has several subspecies, including the Florida diamondback and Carolina diamondback. This subspecies differ in their geographic range, coloration, and venom composition. Then, red-tailed hawk, Buteo jamaicanus. This bird of prey is polytypic and has several subspecies, including the western red-tailed hawk and the eastern red-tailed hawk. The subspecies differ in their physical characteristics, vocalizations, and habitat preferences. Polytypic species are important for several reasons. First, they provide insights into the evolutionary history and biogeography of a particular taxonomic group, as well as the processes that drive population differentiation and speciation. Secondly, they are important for conservation efforts as they often have distinct genetic lineages and unique ecological adaptations that may require targeted conservation strategies. Finally, they are important for understanding the genetic basis of adaptation and evolution as well as the mechanisms that underlie phenotypic variation within and between populations. So, in conclusion, polytypic species are taxonomic groups that contain multiple subgroups or subspecies. They can be clinal, geographic, or ecological in nature and are identified based on a combination of morphological, molecular, ecological, and behavioral characteristics. Then polytypic species are important for scientific study, conservation efforts, and understanding the mechanisms of evolution and adaptation. Next, ecospecies and xenospecies. Ecospecies and xenospecies are two concepts in taxonomy that describe different ways of defining species. While the traditional definition of a species is based on interbreeding and reproductive isolation, these concepts focus on other factors such as ecological and environmental factors like ecospecies. An ecospecies is a taxonomic unit defined by a shared ecological niche or habitat preference. This means that members of an ecospecies have similar ecological requirements or are adapted to similar environmental conditions. Ecospecies are identified based on their unique adaptation to a specific environment or habitat and can be distinguished from other taxonomic units based on these adaptations. For example, in the case of cichlid fish in African lakes, closely related species are found in different ecological niches within the same lake. The species are adapted to different depths, food sources, and other ecological factors, leading to a clear distinction between different ecospecies. Then, xenospecies. A xenospecies is a taxonomic unit defined by a shared ecological community. This means that members of a xenospecies are part of the same ecological network, interacting with each other and with other species in the community. Xenospecies are identified based on their functional roles within the community and the unique ecological relationships they have with other species. For example, a xenospecies can be defined by a group of pollinators that are dependent on a particular plant species for nectar or pollen. This plant species and the pollinators form a functional group within the community, and their interactions with other species of the community are important for maintaining the overall ecological balance. What is important? Ecospecies and xenospecies are important concepts in ecology and conservation biology. Xenospecies is a taxonomic unit defined as a shared ecological community. This means that members of a xenospecies are part of the same ecological network, interacting with each other and with other species in the community. But ecospecies are taxonomic units defined by a shared ecological niche or habitat preference. This means that members of an ecospecies have similar ecological requirements. Then, by focusing on ecological functions, factors rather than reproductive isolation, these concepts allow for a more nuanced understanding of species diversity and the way in which species interact with their environment. This info can be useful in conservation efforts and as it helps to identify key species and ecological relationships that need to be protected. So, in conclusion, ecospecies and xenospecies are two concepts in taxonomy that focus on ecological factors rather than reproductive isolation to define species. So, ecospecies are defined as a shared ecological niche or habitat preference, while xenospecies are defined by a shared ecological community. Those concepts are important for understanding the unique adaptations and ecological relationships that define species and can be useful in conservation efforts. Then, ecospecies types, description, and examples. Ecospecies is a taxonomic unit that is defined based on the ecological niche or habitat preference of a particular group of organisms. Ecospecies are characterized by their unique adaptations to a specific environment and habitat. This concept is often used in ecology and conservation biology to identify and describe different types of species. This type of ecospecies is found in water bodies like lakes, rivers, and oceans. Aquatic ecospecies are adapted to life in water and can be further classified into different groups based on the depth they inhabit, salinity, and temperature. Then terrestrial ecospecies will be there. This type of ecospecies is found on land and can be further classified into different groups based on their habitat preferences such as forests, grasslands, deserts, and tundra. Then arboreal ecospecies. This type of ecospecies is found in trees and is adapted to life in the canopy or higher levels of forests. Arboreal ecospecies are adapted to climbing, leaping, or gliding and have specialized adaptations like prehensile tails and opposable thumbs. Then subterranean ecospecies. This type of ecospecies is adapted to living underground, such as burrowing mammals, insects, and reptiles. Examples of ecospecies: Galapagos finches. Charles Darwin famously studied the finches on the Galapagos Island and observed that they had different beak shapes and sizes depending on their habitat and food sources. This led him to develop his theory of natural selection and the origin of species. Then African cichlid fish. African cichlids are a group of freshwater fish that have evolved into many different ecospecies with unique ecological adaptations, such as feeding habitats and body shape. Australian marsupials. Australia has a high number of unique marsupial species which have evolved in isolation from other mammals and have adapted to specific niches like tree dwelling and burrowing. Then, importance of ecospecies. Understanding the diversity of life ecospecies help to identify and describe the different types of species that exist in the world and unique adaptations that define them. Ecospecies are important for conservation efforts because they highlight the unique adaptations and ecological relationships that need to be protected. And also important in ecological research, along with that evolutionary studies. These are the major important points. Then, xenospecies. Xenospecies, also known as agamo-species, are a type of species that reproduce asexually and are genetically identical. Xenospecies are derived from the Greek word kinos, which means vacant or empty. This type of species is not based on the ability to interbreed, but is defined based on the morphological and ecological characters that are shared among the members of the group. Like types of xenospecies, microspecies. Microspecies are groups of plants that are morphologically indistinguishable but have differences in their reproductive structures. These differences are often related to the number and position of the stamens and pistils. The concept of microspecies is important in plant taxonomy because it allows for a more precise identification of plant species. So, microspecies are groups of plants that are morphologically distinguishable but have differences in their reproductive structures. These differences are often related to the number and position of the stamens and pistils. The concept of microspecies is important in plant taxonomy because it allows for a more precise identification of plant species. Then, cultivar. Cultivars are a type of xenospecies that are produced by selective breeding and are genetically identical. Cultivars are often used in agriculture and horticulture to produce plants that with desirable traits like disease resistance or increased yield. Then paraspecies. Paraspecies are groups of animals or plants that are morphologically indistinguishable but have different ecological preferences or host associations. This type of xenospecies is important in understanding the ecological relationships between different species and their co-evolution. Then examples of xenospecies. Banana. Banana is a type of cultivar that has been produced through selective breeding over thousands of years. All commercially grown bananas are genetically identical and have no seeds. Then citrus fruits. Citrus fruits like oranges, lemons, and grapefruits are also cultivars that have been produced through selective breeding. Then dandelions. Then importance of xenospecies. Agriculture and horticulture xenospecies, particularly cultivars, are important. Then conservation xenospecies, ecological relationships study, along with that evolutionary studies. So these are the importance. Then next topic, morphospecies. Morphospecies is a term used to describe groups of organisms that are defined based on their physical or morphological characteristics. These characteristics may include features such as size, shape, color, or other visible traits. Morphospecies are often used in fields such as paleontology and ecology to describe the diversity of life. Then types of morphospecies. Ecophenotypic morphospecies. Ecophenotypic morphospecies are groups of organisms that have different physical characteristics depending on their environment or habitat. The differences are often related to availability of resource, temperature, or other environmental factors. This type of morphospecies is important in understanding how organisms adapt to their environment. Then fossil morphospecies. Fossil morphospecies are groups of organisms that are defined based on their physical characteristics as preserved in the fossil record. This type of morphospecies is important in paleontology as it allows scientists to describe and categorize extinct species. Then cryptic morphospecies are groups of organisms that look very similar but very actually they are actually genetically distinct. This type of morphospecies is important in molecular biology and genetics, as it allows scientists to study the genetic diversity of species, different populations. What is the example of morphospecies? Dinosaurs, then snails, then beetles. They are important. Ecology morphospecies are very important. Then paleontology morphospecies is also very important. Genetic morphospecies. Then conservation field, very important. So these are the important factors. Later, superspecies. Superspecies, also known as sibling species, are groups of organisms that are closely related and resemble each other in appearance but are genetically distinct and reproductively isolated from one another. Superspecies are often found in organisms that have diversified rapidly and have undergone adaptive radiation. So, types of superspecies. Geographical superspecies is there. Geographical superspecies are groups of organisms that are geographically isolated from each other and have diverged genetically as a result of this isolation. This type of superspecies is important in understanding how geographic barriers can lead to speciation. Then ecological superspecies. Ecological superspecies are groups of organisms that have adapted to different ecological niches and are reproductively isolated as a result. This type of superspecies is important in understanding how competition for resources can lead to speciation. Later, cryptic superspecies is there. Are groups of organisms that are morphologically similar but genetically distinct and reproductively isolated. This type of superspecies is important in understanding the genetic diversity of different populations, like Anopheles gambiae complex. That's my mosquito species. The different species in the complex are morphologically similar but genetically distinct and are considered to be superspecies. Then Lasioglossum sweat bees. These are morphologically similar but are genetically distinct and are reproductively isolated too. Then Ensartina salamanders. Salamanders that are found along the Pacific coast of North America. Different populations of Ensartina salamanders are considered to be part of a superspecies, as they are morphologically similar but genetically distinct and are reproductively isolated. Then importance of superspecies, evolutionary biology field and ecology, medical research, then conservation, etc. are very important. Then next topic, species as a population complex. Species can be defined as a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce a fertile offspring. However, in some cases, it may not be possible to define a species based on this criterion alone, especially when dealing with organisms that have complex patterns of reproduction or are geographically isolated. In such cases, a population complex may be used to define a species. What is the definition of population complex? A population complex is a group of populations that are closely related and share a common evolutionary history. These populations may have different physical or genetic characteristics but can interbreed and produce viable offspring. Population complex can provide valuable information about the genetic diversity and evolution of a species. Genetic drift, genetic gene flow, evolution, etc. Then examples of population complexes. The hawthorn fly in North America. The species is composed of several different populations, each of which feeds on a different species of hawthorn. 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 These populations have diverged genetically and behaviorally, but still interbreed and produce viable offspring. Then geographical isolation will be happening. Then reproductive barriers are there. Along with that, hybridization happens. And we learn about the importance for conservation. These are very important. So after that, gene flow and genetic variation will be occurring, hybridization is there, evolutionary processes taking place, ecological interactions will be there, species concepts. Next topic, species concepts. There are a range of different species concepts that have been proposed to define and distinguish species. This include the biological species concept, which defines species based on their reproductive isolation from other populations, the morphological species concept, which defines species based on their physical characteristics, and the phylogenetic species concept, which defines species based on their evolutionary history and genetic relationships. What are the challenges in species identification? Like DNA sequencing technologies and molecular markers have provided new tools for specific species identification and classification, but these approaches also have limitations and can raise questions about the validity of traditional species concepts. The concept of species has a long history in biology with various definitions and criteria used to define and distinguish different species. A species is a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring under natural conditions and are reproductively isolated from other groups. The species concept is fundamental to the study of biodiversity and evolution as it provides a framework for categorizing and organizing the diversity of life on Earth. The concept of species has been debated and refined by biologists for centuries, with many different criteria and definitions proposed. One of the earliest and most influential definitions was proposed by Linnaeus in the 18th century, who defined species as fixed and immutable entities that were created by God. This view persisted for many years but was gradually replaced by a more evolutionary perspective in the 19th century with the emergence of Darwin's theory of evolution and the recognition that species are not fixed entities but rather dynamic and changing over time. Since then, a range of different species concepts have been proposed and debated by scientists, including the biological species concept, the morphological species concept, the phylogenetic species concept, and others. There are various types of species concept like biological species concept, then morphological species concept, phylogenetic species concept, then ecological species concept like that. Scientists called Linnaeus, then Ernest Mayr, along with the David Hull. Then examples include typological species concept like that. Typological species concept. The typological species concept is one of the earliest and most basic concepts of species classification. It was proposed by Carl Linnaeus, the father of modern taxonomy in the 18th century. According to this concept, a species is defined based on a set of physical characteristics or traits that are shared by all individuals within a species and distinguish it from other species. So, morphological typological species concept. This type of species concept defines a species based on the physical or morphological traits of individuals. It assumes that individuals within a species share a common morphological structure that distinguishes them from other species. For example, the common house cat, Felis catus, is defined as a set of physical traits including its size, fur color, eye shape, and other morphological features that distinguish it from other species of cats. Then paleontological typological species concept. This type of species concept defines a species based on the fossil record. It assumes that a species is a group of organisms that share a set of physical characteristics such as observed in the fossils and distinguish them from other groups. For example, the dinosaur species Tyrannosaurus rex is defined based on a set of physical characteristics that are observed in fossil record. So, typological species concept is based on the assumption that all individuals within a species share a common set of physical or morphological traits that distinguish them from other species. It assumes that these traits are fixed and do not vary within the species. This it defines a species based on a particular type specimen, which is based on a reference point for all other individuals within the species. An example of a species that is defined based on the typological species concept is the gray wolf, Canis lupus. The species is defined based on a set of physical characteristics including its size, fur color, eye shape, and other morphological features. Similarly, the Bengal tiger, Panthera tigris, is defined based on its physical traits including its size, fur pattern, and other morphological features. The typological species concept was one of the earliest and most basic concepts of species classification. It provides a simple and straightforward way to identify and classify species based on physical traits. So that's all about this topic. Thank you for listening.